Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Turning Point. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Jenny Liu. Jenny researches resilience, and she holds several positions. Among them, she is a postdoctoral associate with the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center, as well as an adjunct research professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Western University, which also happens to be my alma mater, so shout out to Western. Jenny's biggest turning point happened when she was a graduate student and she was being cyberstalked. It changed the course of her life and her studies. We'll hear more about that today. Jenny, welcome to Turning Point.
Hi, Priya. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so excited to talk to you today.
I'm so excited to have you and for all of our listeners and viewers to hear your story, because in our pre-interview, I just found it really impactful and something that I continued to think about for days after. So I obviously had a chance to get to know you a little bit then, but just for our viewers and listeners, before we get to your turning point, can you take us back to your childhood? Your parents were both professors. Yes. You lived in Japan, Canada, the United States. What was that like for you?
Yeah, you know what? It's nice to be able to take us through this journey together. So just a little bit of background about myself. It's true, both of my parents were engineers as well as professors. And being in academia, lots of traveling, lots of uprooting, lots of moving around. So I was born in China, and at a fairly early age, I would say, my mom decided she wanted me to go to Japan with her. And so there I was, leaving my whole childhood behind, and then I went to Japan to be with both of my parents, who were professor and engineers at the time in Japan. Unfortunately, during that time, I was really badly bullied. And it wasn't the best childhood experience, obviously, constantly being bullied, and also your parents being so busy that they're never around to actually be there for you, or to really understand what it was like, the everyday bullying experience. So as a result of that, I finally came close to telling my parents the full stories of what happened and how I was feeling, and they then decided, you know what, it's time to move. Let's go to Canada. Right. So, yeah, so there I was. I immigrated to Canada at the age of 9. We first settled in Vancouver and then moved to Toronto. And then my mom, while I was in high school, decided maybe she wanted to leave Canada behind and move to a little bit south to the US. So we moved to Iowa for a little bit and then came back. So here I am.
That is a lot of moving around. And as a kid, obviously, it means moving to new schools. I mean, learning different languages, experiencing different cultures, making new friends. You mentioned the bullying you experienced. Can you tell us what you remember about that?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a tough period. And I think, bullying probably happens a lot more frequently than we realize. But for me, it was really coming from a place of them seeing that I didn't belong. I mean, and I really didn't, right? I didn't speak the language. I just showed up to school one day, joined a class, and there I was learning. What's so great about Canada is you have things like ESL. You have things that really accommodate and facilitate that transition. But in Japan, at least at the time, right, there really wasn't such a thing. So I was just thrown into this new environment. And others didn't think I fit. So as a result, they bullied me. They called me names. They made fun of my hair, my clothes, my accent. And, as a child, everything hurts. Right? You take everything very personally.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think when you think about maybe anyone who's listening or watching, like people in your life who've moved around a lot around the country, I think that's hard enough as it is. But when you add all these layers of different countries, different cultures, you know, and sort of feeling othered right from the get-go. And I think as a child, like, did you find it hard to express some of those feelings? Because I'm not sure I would have even had the words to tell someone what I was going through.
100%. And part of the challenge was me trying to understand what was happening. You don't necessarily think right away when you're experiencing these things, aha, I am being bullied. I am a victim, right? You don't really go there. Instead, it's more about internalizing that. So feeling like, oh yeah, I am different, because you've already felt that a little bit. You didn't speak the language, you didn't have any new friends. You left all your friends behind, and here you are, right? And others telling you you are different and therefore you deserve to be treated differently. And you really internalize that. It becomes kind of part of you. That felt like, yeah, it felt strange to be in that environment, almost like an out-of-body experience.
I can imagine that. Yeah, I mean, you're a kid, so you're kind of getting through every day and not know. I mean, also at that time, the way we talk about bullying and these experiences now is so different than it would have been at that time. And it's certainly not perfect now, but I think there's been some progress in at least having those conversations.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not aging myself per se, but we didn't have social media then, right? It wasn't like a quick Google search to see what you're experiencing. It was very much isolated experiences. I mean, not to, again, age myself, but back then there's no Google. Google wasn't really around then. And, you know, if you wanted to do anything on the computer, you had to listen to the dial tone and wait to be on the internet.
Well, I also remember those days, so I'll age myself with you.
Great. We won't go any more specific than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. So you did end up having an aha moment of sorts in your high school psych class. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting because those childhood experiences, they really stay with you, but in the most unexpected ways, I guess. I used to be this very popular, bright, outgoing kid before I moved to Japan. And then the experiences in Japan kind of made me retreat a little bit more into myself, a little bit more reflective, a little bit more reserved, so to speak. And in high school, when you had that challenge and change in society where you get introduced to psychology, sociology, anthropology, we talked about childhood and attachment and what those childhood experiences, how they might transition and affect you later on in life. And that was my aha moment. I thought, oh, that's why my personality changed. That's why certain things, not to explain everything, but now I can understand how those experiences carry over into your adulthood. And that was so fascinating to me.
That must have been, I mean, a really powerful moment. And I know I talked about a little bit about your research in the intro there, but this moment and this class really helped you develop an interest in psychology. So is that what led to you pursuing that course of studies?
Absolutely. I just thought at the moment, there's just so much unknown in the world, but it really starts with our minds, because our minds shape all of our experiences. It shapes what we're interested in, how we perceive things, how we understand things. And so, rather than trying to advance myself in any particular field, let me just try and focus on my own mind. It was really that interest in introspection that made me pursue psychology.
It's so fascinating to hear. I mean, when you think about where someone is today, I always love hearing, how they ended up there. And I know that this was kind of a turning point or one of the turning points in your life. And you did go on, as we mentioned, to pursue studies in psychology in graduate school. And this is really where your biggest turning point happened. So I know this was a really difficult period of time for you. Can you take us back there and tell us about your experience?
Sure. So I guess to preface this a little bit, studying psychology, I gradually became more and more interested in just how we handle the ups and downs in life, right? Also known as stress. And that was kind of my area of specialization. I just grew more and more interested in the idea of stress, how we get stressed out, what stresses us out, how we cope with stress. And I pursued that in my graduate studies as well. And in graduate studies, you have to do things like practicum, where you go outside of your department and your program to pursue extra specializations and research training. So during my practicum, during my master's, I encountered a postdoctoral fellow who was in that lab at the time, who grew really interested in me beyond my research and beyond academics. And this interest really ended up being a little bit more obsessive in that kind. So he started following my activities even when I'm not at work, became very obsessed with where I was, what was I doing, try to contact me during all hours, when I'm not at work, during the weekend, during holidays. And it became a little bit obsessive and a bit, at some point, I was actually a little bit worried about my safety.
That is really scary. And also, I'm sure at that time, like, was it hard to talk about? I think sometimes these situations, when someone does something that everyone can agree, like, for example, if there's violence, I think there's this very clear line that the law draws for us that this is wrong. This is, this is a punishable offense. But in this situation, when someone was really cyber stalking you and as you say, exhibiting this obsessive behavior, like, was it hard for you to talk about and to explain to other people why it was concerning?
Absolutely. And I think there's so many layers to this, right? There's the fact that that you are in a position of weakness, right? Your status is not as high as the other person who's kind of doing that to you. There's also the layer of me being a woman, right? And speaking up and fearing kind of the repercussions of that, fearing the stigma of, well, did I do something to give the impression that I could be bothered during these off hours, that I should be contacted, that I am somehow interested in receiving some kind of, communications. There's also the ethnic minority part too, right? The person that had been contacting me that was demonstrating this behavior, he was Caucasian and I am not. So the multitude of layers there just, it makes it hard to talk about. It's also hard to understand because you internalize so much of that experience. Again, just like bullying, right? You wonder, like, did I do something? Am I the one contributing to this?
I'm nodding along because a completely different situation, but I completely understand in all of these power dynamics and the layers of race as well. That resonates with me, and I've been there, and it's really stressful mentally to be thinking about all of these things as you're experiencing a situation where you're concerned for your safety, and rightfully so, given this behavior.
Absolutely. And you don't want to sound the alarm necessarily in a way where you're thinking, okay, well, I am at the same time that token representation of all of these things, right? Of the woman in science, the, minority, right, and the young academic. You are also at the same time representative of all of those roles, all of those identities. And so the minute you speak up, you wonder, am I now tainting all of those identities in addition to just you being you, right? So just a lot of a lot of internal struggles I had to overcome before I finally spoke up.
So what did make you decide to take that step and speak up?
Actually, I will be very, very honest. Had it been just me, I don't think I could have, or at least I wouldn't have known what would have been, my turning point, so to speak. But what happened was that this person started contacting people outside of just me, started contacting my colleagues in my department, started contacting my coworkers, asking about me. And so now I'm getting others coming to me saying, what's going on? Are you disappearing? Like, someone's very concerned. We don't know what to do. And they sounded the alarm. And I think they were kind of the external checkpoints I needed to really shift my perspective and say, hey, if others are saying this is not okay, it probably wasn't that okay. Let me tell someone about this.
So what did that look like when you decided that it was time to say something? What did you have to do?
So in terms of action, pretty little. All I had to do was just forward some correspondences to my supervisor at the time and say, hey, this is what's happening. But such little actions was such an emotionally cathartic moment. The second I hit send on that email, it was just like, I had a good cry. It was like all of these things that were bottled up inside me. And finally, it's like, I have created an outlet and now they're out in the world. It is what it is. And it was so stressful, but so cathartic at the same time. It just felt like such a release.
How was that received by your supervisor?
It's interesting because my supervisors at the time almost had like a dual sort of experience because so full disclosure, the entire team of people around at the time were all women. And I think that helped a little bit, right? So some of the initial reactions from supervisors and from some of the peers was, oh, did you do something to give that? And then they doubled back and said, no, we're not going there. This is unacceptable, period, right? So, and I really want to highlight that kind of response because so much of that is not really their inherent response. It's more about the socialization of our culture and what we're taught and what we see and what our knee-jerk reaction is in these situations. And I give them so much props for circling back and say, no, we're not going there. We're going to take care of you. We're going to protect you and let us investigate, let us emphasize, highlight, and scale up and blow up this situation so that we can kind of get to the bottom of it.
I'm so happy to hear that was the reaction because I think this was about 7 years ago, but even now, and even more so then, you heard so many stories where what you mentioned there, that initial reaction was like, oh, well, what did you do? Where the woman is questioned and you're almost guilty until you prove that you haven't done anything, which is not how it should be. And, I like to think we've made some progress since then, but I'm so happy that was the reaction because had it not been, that could have changed everything as well. So after this happened, you received this support. There is an investigation. What happened during the investigation?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you think you're the only one going through this. When these things happen to you, right, you don't speak up because you're worried about all the consequences and what happens. But the second that lid comes off and things come to the open, you find out so much more. And during the investigations, and props to everyone involved that kept kind of escalating the situation, there were so many more quote unquote victims that were discovered. So turns out the person who had been kind of harassing me was also simultaneously harassing other students. And these are undergraduate students. These are volunteers in the lab. These are just, again, similar ethnic background, right? Asian, petite women. And the thing is, some of them had way less power than me, even in those moments, right? They had real repercussions of speaking up because then their grades are affected. Then their credits are affected, their job, their occupations, their careers might be affected. Whereas, I was kind of the external practicum student that really didn't have a whole lot to lose if I spoke up because I didn't actually belong to that particular institution. And so dozens of students uncovered.
What you said there about this experience feeling really isolating at first, I mean, it must have been such a shift for you when you found out that there were other victims as well. I imagine it was a mix of emotions.
Yeah, it really was. And the entire ordeal didn't take that long, right? Because once the escalation of investigation happened, it was just like rapidly, just all of these things are being uncovered all at once. And so, at first you're just overwhelmed with the sheer amount of information. What started out feeling isolated, it became really then a transformation of, okay, now I understand, and now I feel like there was a reason why I spoke up, and now I feel like I'm glad I spoke up. You go from doubts of, should I have done this? Like, did I blow this out of proportion, to now feeling some type of vindication, or at least just appreciation for the way that things unfolded, because now you realize someone doesn't just work up to those kind of behaviors overnight, right? The amount of harassment, reaching out to colleagues, texting, and so to really truly uncover the extent of that, and also so that everyone affected can now be supported. There can now be real consequences for the perpetrator, right? And that's just kind of the whole sort of roller coaster of emotions coming to a full circle.
And I'm sure a lot of the other victims were really grateful that you spoke up, because I'm sure it gave them the confidence they needed to also speak up and share what had happened to them.
I hope so. And, one of the things is that there's not really an opportunity to connect with others. Not that I don't think the circumstances would have called for, but to understand, or maybe at least beginning to understand a little bit of what they may have felt, which is just the discomfort, the sheer kind of shock, and maybe because they felt probably powerless to speak up, right? And to know that maybe you made a difference in their lives, I think that's what made me kind of have closure at the end of that.
Yeah, I can imagine. And just that reminder, like you said, that no, without a doubt, you did the right thing. But I think that it must have, as you were going through it, during those tough times when you had those moments of, oh, should I have said anything? Mm-hmm. I'm sure that kind of sealed the deal that you did the right thing by speaking up, despite how difficult it must have been.
Absolutely. And I feel like, at the end of the day, if nothing else happened, at least we know that this person can no longer do what they did to me and others in the capacity that he was doing that at.
100%. Before this happened, you were studying stress, and this really changed your focus, right?
It did. It completely created this pivot that really, became a whole research program of its own.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to hear more about this, because you started to study resilience, and maybe actually we can just start with resilience and what it is, because I think we use this word a lot, especially during the pandemic. We've been talking so much about resilience, but I think it can mean different things to different people. So how would you define resilience when it comes to your research?
Absolutely. And you know what? That's a perfect place to start, because let's talk first about what resilience shouldn't be understood as. We see it now more than ever. And honestly, if maybe I can speak for the rest of us, but I'm so tired of the word resilience and seeing it everywhere. I don't know about you.
Agreed.
Yeah? Okay, good. I
feel the same way
about this, but resilience is often kind of perpetuated or put out there as this internal characteristic, this trait, this disposition that is found within some individuals and not in others. And that's what makes them successful in life. That's what makes them thrive and achieve great things, whether it's like an Olympian or, this like amazingly successful person that overcame all of these challenges. And to some extent it is, but it's not that destination. Resilience is that process. And so if I were to very clearly define what resilience should be understood as. It's really about our capacity to respond to the challenges in our lives. And that capacity speaks to the process of response, not to the outcome.
And as you define it this way, I think what I'm also getting from it is that you can develop and work on resilience.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Am I right?
Absolutely. And this is kind of that pivot or that turning point where I realized that, because going back to my experience earlier and reflecting back, again, I'm kind of like this introspective person. After I experience something, I like to just sit there and think about, what happened there? Right. And so during these moments, I thought about resilience. I thought about the word, because I always liked the word, right? I wasn't hearing it like 20 times a day like we are now. And I thought about, would I define myself as resilient in that context? And then I thought, yeah, I guess the outcome was desirable to some extent, right? The outcome was quote unquote successful in terms of, the investigation and all the things that happened as a result and the consequences that followed. But then I thought to myself, well, then how would you define resilience? How did you get there? Could you have done that on your own? And I thought, no. If I First of all, I didn't even want to speak up, right? Because I internalized so much of what happened to me. And then I thought, if at the moment of speaking up, or even before when my colleagues were coming to me and saying, hey, sound the alarm, this is not okay. If I didn't have that group of incredible women rallying around to support me and support my experience, I would not have this outcome. And so that process of support, of me speaking up, but then receiving that support back and that validation back, that is truly what determined my outcome. And so if I defined my experience as resilient, well, it wasn't just me that was resilient, right? It was me being able to access those support. And within a larger sort of framework or institution, right? We're in university, so you have kind of these structural components that really add that layer of support. You know who to go to for your higher up, and you know there are people and channels and programs available to support that entire process. And so then I realized, okay, so then resilience is not just something that we either have or we don't have. It's more about navigating your challenge and accessing the support that you need when you need it.
I have never thought about resilience in this way, and I think it's a really refreshing perspective, because I do think that sometimes we have this feeling, like what you said earlier, that it's like this innate thing. You either have it or you don't. Mm-hmm. And then if you do go through a difficult situation and, have a breakdown or, experience a mental health challenge, for example, which so many of us will experience in our lifetimes and have experienced, especially during the pandemic. Yeah. You just can start to easily think that you're not a resilient person, and not think about what is contributing to that and what could possibly help in the case of, something else happening. So I really appreciate this idea of it's not just about who you are and how you were born, but also, what supports do you have, what programs are available to you, what people are around you. And I think this actually leads really nicely into a question about something that you've developed through your research, which is called the Multisystem model of resilience application. So what is it, and how did your research lead to this?
Absolutely. It's just kind of naturally fell in place. After that experience, the very next thing I had to do was to do my comprehensive exams, which is, you pick a topic that you are not an expert on, and you investigate and you explore that topic. And so I thought, I'm going to do resilience now. Now I can finally do this. And I looked at how other researchers approached resilience research. right? How do they define it? How do they investigate it? And I was surprised that so much of it was focused on the individual capacity. Just within themselves, what kind of tools, what kind of skills, what kind of traits, what kind of personality dimensions does someone have? And how does that relate to their resilience? And I thought, where is that interaction? Right? Because we don't live in bubbles. So every time we encounter an event, is that interaction or negotiation, right? Do we have enough resources to deal with a situation? If this situation changes, what needs to give on our end? And, if there's a pandemic happening, I mean, there is, right? And, we have to work from home. Like, do we have the capacity to set up an office at home, right? Do we have the space? Do we have the resources? Does our company have the resources to support? It's like all of those layers or systems that support resilience. And when I realized that was lacking in the literature, I set out to then define these systems more clearly. I tried to carve out, okay, we know part of our resilience has to come from within us, right? That part of the research is clear. Let's fill in the missing places and the spots, the holes. Where are the other systems coming in? So if we think of resilience as our gas tank in the car, right? Do we only fill it up from one gas station? Or can we fill it up from multiple, right? And also, where we fill it up and how much gas we need is also dependent on our journey. So if we're driving from Toronto to Montreal, it'll probably take more than one tank. And, right, or as if we're just going to the corner for grocery shopping, you probably don't need to fill up anything at all. So that's kind of the negotiation process, that interaction that we have with every challenge that comes to us. And so for the multi-system model of resilience, it's really about defining the systems of our resilience and also understanding what those systems support, what our resilience needs.
And so you mentioned some of the supports that go into that, the people around you, the programs maybe that you have access to. Mm-hmm. What else would you consider to support resilience for someone?
Absolutely. The other things that we sometimes don't think about is this idea of belonging, the sense of belonging, that psychological safety piece that sometimes gets overlooked. But we see it now a little bit in organizations. We see it especially in the pandemic, right? When your organization or your institution doesn't necessarily support you or have policies that you feel like are contradictory to your beliefs or your values, that creates a lot of tension. And it's hard to thrive under those circumstances, right? So things like that. Being able to regulate your emotions, being healthy, having healthy practices and behaviors, not only having support, but also knowing where they are. Because if you have them, but you don't use them, they might as well not exist, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So then how can people use this model to build their resilience?
Mm-hmm. Our resilience really comes from that deeper understanding of, well, what do we need? Because we know, for example, Priya, you and I, right, where we're having this conversation now, but if we turn around and we encounter the challenges, whatever they may be, the next challenge that we both encounter, chances are what we need to overcome that challenge will be very different. And so part of that resiliency is being able to understand your needs at any given time and then finding the resources to support. And so from the model, I created a free digital application. It's called the Multisystem Model of Resilience, or the MSMR. And I created the app that's freely available. It's a set of questions. And all you have to do at any time is just to answer those questions to see, what's your snapshot resilience look like, right? How are your systems supporting your needs? And, what areas might you want to work on, or what areas are you good at?
This is so fascinating. And something I've never, I mean, it's such a unique concept I've never heard of before. And for anyone who's listening and watching, if you're interested in taking a closer look at this, we're going to put a link to the application in the show notes so anyone can access it. As Jenny mentioned, it is free for anyone to use. So thank you so much for sharing that, Jenny. And on that note, what are you currently studying about resilience? I know that was one of your biggest projects.
Yeah, it was. And it was kind of, it's a launching point, I would say, right? Because now we understand that resilience is not this fixed, static thing that doesn't change. It's this fluctuating capacity. There's so much now we can do with it. Think employee assistance programs. So much of those programs are underutilized because we don't know where to start, right? Do we need yoga or do we need better structural support? So just working with different groups now to understand their resilience capacity and needs. Because we all have them, but they're all different. And so one size fits all solutions just don't work. Right? We can't just assign everyone to go meditate and think that that's okay, right? Sometimes they don't need that. Sometimes they need days off, paid days off. And so to really build and support resilience and do that with different groups is kind of what I'm working on now. Some of the specific projects are starting next year, I'm going to launch a resilience program for new veterans. So it's going to be funded by CIHR, and we're going to build some online resilience training based on the specific needs of new veterans as they transition out of service. Some of the other programs are we're trying to understand child protection workers' resilience needs during the pandemic, healthcare workers' needs during the pandemic, as well as some of the minority populations, Asian Canadians, who have been affected by the discrimination that was on the rise during the pandemic. How do we support their resilience, especially as the pandemic continues to evolve?
This is all incredibly fascinating and obviously very timely. I feel like you're going to have another turning point from the research that you're doing here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? This is kind of the process of discovery that I love so much about just being in science, being in academia. It's about that process of understanding something deeper, gaining that insight, and then perhaps pivoting. One thing that has, really been kind of the undercurrent of all of these projects is really the structural resiliency part that we often really overlook. And I think we're just beginning to tap into how important it is to have supportive structures, supportive policies, supportive environments around us. It's not just about, digging deep and finding some grittiness inside of ourselves to pull through. It's about facilitating these environments where we can truly respond to challenges.
Well, I can't think of a better time to be doing this research. Obviously, resilience is top of mind. So many of us have had such a challenging couple of years with the pandemic. I look forward to continuing to follow you, to following your research. And I wonder now, it's been about 7 years since you were a victim of a cyber stalker, this turning point that changed everything for you. Mm-hmm. As you reflect back on everything that's happened since then, what are you most proud of?
I think the pride comes from the reflection and the journey and the process. And so much of that is that resiliency piece, right? And so I want to kind of also take this moment to just share this with anyone who's listening to this, is that you are resilient simply by being. I know there's going to be moments where, you might struggle, you might not see yourself as that way, right? And I really want to take this moment to validate anyone who's going through anything at all, who's struggling, languishing, or just, living life and thriving, is that we're all resilient. We're resilient simply by navigating through life. Can we become more resilient? Perhaps by learning to negotiate or navigate those resources better. But we're resilient simply by being, and there's no need to kind of question that. And, so much of the pandemic has really shed light on the structural inequities, the inequitable access to healthcare services, to financial support, to social services. And sometimes we will struggle and we will think it's because of ourselves, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's because of circumstances beyond our own capacity to change. And so I hope that anyone listening won't question their resiliency and instead simply accept that we're all resilient.
That's such a perfect message to leave us with today. Jenny, thank you so much for sharing your turning point, your story, and for sharing an inspiring message about resilience and really what it really is, rather than kind of the way that maybe we define it in our everyday lives right now. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Priya, for so much for having me. It was so fun to talk to you. I know that sounds kind of weird given the topic, but it truly was a pleasure. And I look forward to having many turning points. So maybe you'll have me back here someday.
I would absolutely love that. Thank you so much, Jenny.
My pleasure. You take care.
You too. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. You can, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a comment, let us know what you thought of this episode. As I mentioned, I'm going to put a link to the application that Jenny mentioned in the show notes as well, so you can check it out there. You can also follow us on your favorite podcast app. We are on all podcast platforms. And hey, if you yourself have a turning point or you know someone who does, please send us an email. You can reach us at turningpoint@priyasam.com. We love hearing from you. Until next time, take good care of yourself and of each other.